Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 11th chapter in the book of John. We took it from verses 28 all the way till 44, and what takes place before it we covered in a different lesson. We entitled that one, Corey Johnston, the range, and then the resurrection and life. And there we read the promise of the resurrection. In the section we covered after that one, we discuss the manifestation of the promise, the manifestation of the miracle, which was the resurrection. The experiencer of the miracle, the witnesses of the miracle were many, but the experiences thereof was Lazarus. He was the brother of the sisterly duo of disciples, Mary and Martha of Magdalene. They lived in Bethany, and they send word to him and tell him that he is sick. And when the word reaches his ear, verse 3, but when Yahshua heard, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the esteem of Elohim, so that the Son of Man might be esteemed by it. So the whole purpose that he was sick was so that he could die in order to be brought back to life. That was the ultimate. He's not dead yet, but he will be. And but the sickness was, so they thought he wasn't going to die, and he didn't die permanently. He did die for a period of 4 days, which made him legally dead, as we'll read. And then in the he says some things to his disciples, and then in the 11th verse he says to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. And there's some confusion about what the term sleep means, and then he says in the 14th verse, so then Yahshua said to them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, in order for you to believe, but let us go to him. So he does in fact stall at the invitation upon receiving word. He actually waits until he dies in order to turn the frowns even further upside down. Oftentimes we don't even know how much we really love someone until they're gone, but imagine them coming back at a funeral. That would just transform the experience all the way. And then in the 24th, he tells Martha, who's weeping. First off, everyone there is weeping, and there are many professional mourners. The Jews did employ professional mourners to add to the aggravation of that day in weeping and wailing. In the 24th verse, after he promises her that her brother will rise again, Martha said to him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection of the last day. So she has faith in what has become a central doctrine to the Jewish Orthodox faith, the resurrection, but she's thinking of the future, and he's bringing it to the present. That is the greatest miracle of all in the section which is known as I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he dies, he shall live. So death will not have the last word if we die in him. If we die in sin, we are not so lucky. But if we die in him, we will be shielded from our sin, and we will experience the resurrection and the life eternal. And the resurrection is future and present, so your eternal life begins now. Think about that and let that map out your life as you go about to and fro. Then in the passage, there's just weeping all around, misery. She is going to weep there. And then Yahshua, therefore, he saw her weeping. So this is weeping and wailing and groaning. And then we read of in verse 35 that Yahshua wept. That is the shortest verse in all of the Bible. 2 words. Every preschool Bible, Sunday school, one child knows that, but it was motivated by love. The Jews, therefore, the ones who were present, say, see how he loved him. So it was all motivated in love, and read that also in the 5th verse. Now Yahshua loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So everything he does is motivated by love. He weeps while he is gone, just because he does have that human emotion, but he also has the divine power to bring the life out of the graveyard and also turned the frowns upside down at the funeral. The funeral became a feast. And then he goes to the place, the tomb, the comb, and there's a stone, and he orders them, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him who has died, said to him, Master, already he smells, for it is 4 days. So 4 days, now he was in the ground 3 days, but Lazarus, who would have been, that's when it would have been the burial time in the Jewish world. So he was already there. His body must have stank. So she advises him or warns him against doing this. But, he says, and I know that you always hear me. So he prays to the Father. Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me. But because of the crowd standing by, I said this in order that they believe that you sent me. So he's talking to his Father in prayer, and he's thanking him in advance for hearing him and answering the prayer. He doesn't even have to say it, but he wants them to have their faith in the fact that he was sent from him, he comes from him, and he is his representative, solidified with that prayer. And then he says, "Come out." Loosen him and let him go. And then that's the 44th verse. So the miracle is accomplished. Now there is the aftermath, the responses and the consequences of having performed a miracle. We read that he officially he is the top wanted list by the high priest. But 45th verse, John's 11th chapter, lesson itself. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to Mary had seen what Yahshua did, believed in him. So the possibility is that many of these Jews were skeptical or doubters or naysayers or had rejected him, but seeing is believing. They saw the power of life in his touch, in the resurrection. This guy had been dead for 4 days. Everyone was mourning, and this guy suddenly shows up. So he just commands it. There's a power in his voice, which the dead is unable to resist coming alive. So there is a profound power in that voice, and many are converted upon having witnessed him. So it was an evangelically successful endeavor, because many of the Jews, now there would have been a large crowd because the Jews took funerals pretty seriously. It was another cultural dimension than what we know and experience in our funerals. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them what Yahshua did. So the Pharisees were the ones who had the vendetta against him. These were the authorized religious rulers at the synagogue level. They were strict legalists, patriots, and they believed in the resurrection. So the last thing they wanted to hear was that the power of the resurrection was in their midst. He had earlier made that claim in the 5th chapter, that the Father delegate in him share the power of the resurrection. But they would have been the ones who were skeptical. So this is but some of them. So those who were converted were joined and attached. But some of them slink away. They want to tell on him. They're ratting him out to the Pharisees, who everyone knows or should know once dead. So even seeing the miracle was not enough to stimulate the faith. They were in the presence of divinity, and they came to a wrong decision. And they survive as an example that may we not make the same mistake. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do, because this man does many signs?" So we read of a new ecclesiastical actor in this, the chief priest. The chief priest would have been the Sadducees, which is the Pharisees' counterparts. They represented two ends of the ideological spectrum, and they were the two rival and often mutually antagonistic factions in the Jewish religion, but they were able to combine in conspiracy against this man. He threatened all their power. He threatened the status quo, and because they equated themselves with the nation, that's why they said, he has to die so that the nation can live. But the high priest at that time would have been Caiaphas. He would have been so named in the year 18 A.D., and he reigned the high priest all the way till 36 A.D., and it was normally or strictly observed to the letter to be a lifetime office, but because of political intrigue and corruption, there was a swap of high priest, and it often relied on one's ability to play the political fence with Rome. That's why the Pharisees were not the high priests. That's why they were not as prominent at the temple level. The Sadducees, the wealthy aristocrats, the liberal, the collaborators, the appeasers, they were the ones. And so he was a Sadducee, but on this he is in agreement with the Pharisees. They know they have to do something, and they all think that life would be a heck of a lot easier if he just got gone. So because they don't deny that the signs, they have no avenue of deniability for these miracles. He is doing things that no one else can do, stuff that no one else has ever done before. he is more than a mere prophet or an ordinary miracle man. He's doing these things, and no one can deny it, and neither can they. So he answers, if we let him alone, or they continue saying, if we let him alone like this, they all shall believe in him, and the Romans shall come and take away from us both our place and our nation. So they felt obligated to intervene violently, if necessary, against him because of the threat that he posed. He threatened to tear down or just demolish the religious, and he could have if he had lived a ripe old age. If he had lived to be 100, it's amazing to think what he could have done on the earth, but Providence had arranged for him to minister within the 3 years, but in those 3 years he accomplished everything that was necessary to accomplish our salvation or secure it. And the Romans, their place, so they were worried about their position. They've coveted the top seats in the room and their seat on the Sanhedrin and just their status and authority. And they regarded themselves as guardians of the nation, so this is something they thought was necessary to do in the interest of the preservation of their nation. And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know not." So Caiaphas is the name I had earlier mentioned. He's the one who oversees and consents to his crucifixion. And that year does not mean that the high priest was an annual office. It was designed to be a lifetime. But remember, political intrigue. The Romans rose one up. You had to basically procure the favor of the Romans in order to procure that position. And the Sadducees, they were infamous for their rudeness. I think the secular historian Josephus says they speak among their peers as if they were aliens and strangers. So that was just their way. They were snide talkers. They looked down their nose at people, and that was just the way they were because of who they were. But he did not say this from himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Yahshua was about to die for the nation. I forgot to read the 50th verse. Neither do you consider that it is better for us that one man die for the people than the entire nation should perish. So he frames his argument in patriotism. He wraps it in the flag. He's saying we got a nation to protect, and if we don't kill this one man, then the entire nation is going to be destroyed. And eventually they got there. He doesn't realize how accurate this prophecy would be. He would one die for the sins of Israel, not just Israel but the world, past, present, and future. And their nation did perish a little less than 40 years later. In the year 70 A.D., they came and raised it down because of zealot-led rebellions. There was a Jewish war that began in 66, and then Rome came in and demolished everything: the temple, Jerusalem, all gone. And that was they never quite recovered after that. The Jewish religion certainly didn't. They lost their genealogies, and the animal sacrifices have all but ceased, although they are maintained by some minority sects out there. And not for the nation only, but he did not say this from himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Yahshua was about to die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but to gather together into one the children of Elohim who were scattered abroad. So this is not this is John's editorial input, his editorial commentary, that his salvation, his atonement was not so narrow as to be restricted to one nation of people. It was global in scope. The entire world can be saved by his blood. And it's all about gathering all of us together. He likens the process and the phenomenon of salvation, of having chicks underneath a mother's wing, a female bird's wing, a mother bird's wing, and scattered abroad. So the children of Elohim at this point would have been the Jews, but eventually in the dispensation, which came after the cross, it expanded to the Gentiles. And so from that day on, they plotted to kill him. So murderous motivations are nothing new. As early as the 5th chapter, also in the 7th, we read that certain Jews were determined to kill him. But now he has the vendetta of the Jews at the top. the top of the pyramid, the high priest, and so he is officially on the top wanted list. He's public enemy number one to them. Excuse me. Joshua therefore no longer went openly among the Jews, but went from there into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and remained there with his disciples. So he has a prudent sense of what's going around and when there's danger, and he can sense that there's this vendetta against him, so he retreats from the site of the miracle, because after all, there is always the divided response in the crowd. Some people embrace him and attach themselves to him. Other people leave and go to the Pharisees, so not everyone believed, even seeing a miracle like that. It is preposterous to even imagine. How could one draw the conclusion they did when they were there? But, they just had wicked hearts. The city of Ephraim is some 15 miles north of Jerusalem, and he is staying there, but he is with his disciples, the 12 in the company, and wilderness would have been desert, so Jerusalem is not too distant from desert. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went from the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to sanctify themselves. So this is the third Passover that he is mentioned in this book, the first of which is in the second chapter. That's when he comes, causes a commotion, clears out the temple. The synoptic authors record him doing this in the final year of his ministry, the final week of his life, which is the time frame alluded to then. So beginning in the 12th chapter, that's the final week of his life, and then the 13th through 19th is the final day of his life. That this is the other Passover is in John 6, when it's near the Passover when he performs the miracle. Evidently, he entered into Jerusalem that year without controversy or causing stirring a commotion or causing a scene. But this is the third and final Passover when he's there. And the Jews, this was one of the 3 holidays they were commanded to go to Jerusalem, although Jerusalem wasn't the location when Deuteronomy 16:16 was written, but it was one of the 3, the others being Pentecost and weeks. And so they were seeking Yahshua and spoke among one another, standing in the temple. What do you think? Is he not coming to the festival at all? So they're waiting for him, and this is before the festival, because there's 6 days before the festival in the 12th chapter, the opening verse. So they're waiting for him. They're anticipating and they're preparing for his arrival, and they're expecting him to come, and they're wanting him to come because, remember, they are determined to kill him. Those who were seeking Yahweh were those who saw Yahshua, were the ones seeking his life. And both the high priest and the Pharisees had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should disclose it in order for them to seize him. So they meant business. They had the order from straight from the high priest themselves. There was a commandment, so there was no room for disobey. It would have been common knowledge amongst all of Jewry, at least those who were connected to him, and they sent the message out that if anyone knows where to find him, you have to tell us now in order for us to take him, physically manhandle him, and basically. But he does show up in the final week of his life and is teaching in their midst, so he is present in their midst, but his hour had not come, his time had not come. The time which is first alluded to in the wedding scene in Cana, 2nd chapter, 4th verse, is coming up after the 12th chapter. He only has a week left in his life. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. See you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.